again, Julian.
Thanks so much indeed. It's great to be here. As you say, the Barnes Philosophy Club is supported by the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and most of the people we support are university departments. So Barnes Philosophy Club is one of the few non-university departments that we support, and we wish there were more of them to support. It's great to have such a thriving society doing its work outside of the universities, and thanks sort of to Barbie. I know that she's the sort of the how do you say this, the founding mother of this, and has really worked to build it up. So thanks for that, and thanks to Nick and Co for taking it on. So today I just wanted to talk about this book I've written called The Godless Gospel. The Godless Gospel really came to us as a project. It was a very simple thought experiment in a way. I just found that over the years, people are consistently saying that they don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, but they do believe he was a great moral teacher. This has almost become a platitude, so uncontroversial that even someone like Richard Dawkins has been on the record saying just this. And I guess I was somewhat, well, I guess I don't like any kind of like easy platitude, to say the least. And I kind of at least wanted to sort of test this theory. Is it really true he was a great moral teacher? Because people say this, but it seems to me in saying it, they seem to be just doffing their cap with respect to Jesus because he has such great cultural importance. And although they're not believers themselves, they want to show they have a certain residual respect. But why? What is it? If you ask people what the teachings of Jesus are, most of them will struggle to really come up with anything much more than love thy neighbor, forgiveness. If you've got two coats, give to someone who has one. And, perfectly nice pieces of moral advice. But in a way, not much that goes beyond the kind of thing you see shared on Instagram memes and so forth, or printed on inspirational posters. So was he really a great moral teacher? Now, of course, this isn't an historical question. I'd like to get that entirely clear. The question about whether there was a historical Jesus, and if so, what he said, is a very, very difficult one. It is a disputed one. The only thing I think people really do agree on is that actually it's almost impossible to answer that question, actually. The sources we have emerged many years after his death, and they contain contradictions within them. So, but then I assume that when people say that they don't believe he was the Son of God, they believe he's a great moral teacher, the only basis for saying that can be those records. So presumably what this means is people think that if you read what Jesus said and did, and you just discount all the things that point to him being divine, what you're left with is the work of a great moral teacher. Is that true? So simple thought experiment, as I say. And the way to do this is simply to go through those gospels, which are the accounts we have, take out the miracles, take out the prophecies, take out the raising from the dead, etc., see what you've got left. I'm not the first person to have had that basic idea. I didn't claim I am. Jefferson did something very similar. The so-called Jefferson Bible was actually given to newly elected members of, I think, Congress or Senate, or maybe both, in the US for quite a long time. Tolstoy also did a very similar exercise. I did it from scratch because I thought both those versions do contain things that I still think are references to God and some miracles and healing. So I didn't want to have that. So I sort of started from scratch. And a big chunk of the book is that. And I think it is actually, I have to say, if you don't find what I say about it interesting, then it itself is interesting. The Gospels are things that I think most people have a vague awareness from school mainly, and even then they perhaps didn't read the Gospels as such, but just had the Bible stories told to them. It's very, very interesting to sort of read them again, stripped of all the miracles. But then my job was to see whether or not there's anything of great philosophical merit behind it. Now, this may seem like a doomed task. This is a George W. Bush. Of course, very famously, when asked who his favorite philosopher was, said it was Jesus Christ. And of course, he was mocked for that, because that seemed to a lot of people be a sign that he didn't actually know anything about philosophy at all. And it also showed perhaps the view that people don't really think that Jesus has a claim to be a moral philosopher. And I think that when I started out the project, I was somewhat skeptical. I didn't see the point in doing the book if it was simply going to be dismissive. But I suppose I did worry that actually at the end of the day, it might turn out to be a bit thin. And well, why is that? Well, I think if you think about again about what does a moral philosopher look like, Jesus doesn't really look like one. So here I think are three key characteristics of what we archetypally take to be a moral philosopher. The photographs there you may recognize of Jeremy Bentham and of David Hume. And of course, one of the things a moral philosopher looked like for many centuries was, in our tradition, the Western tradition, white and male, has to be said. Fortunately, that's changing a lot. But they're superficial things. When I say, what does a moral philosopher look like? I mean, what characteristics makes them a moral philosopher? And I think most people perhaps say these three things. It'd be interesting in the discussion to see whether you think there are other characteristics I haven't mentioned here. One is, and I think this is perhaps a key one, is that they offer arguments. This is the primary image of what any kind of philosopher is like in the Western tradition. What do philosophers do? They give arguments. They don't just dish out teachings. They don't just say, do this and do that. They have arguments which back up what they are claiming, what they are arguing for. Anyone who just sort of like preached, do this, do that, wouldn't be a moral philosopher. They might be a kind of moral teacher, but not a moral philosopher. And I think also we'd say today, perhaps that the question was, is he a great moral teacher? But I think these days we'd think a great moral teacher has to be something of a great moral philosopher too, because without authority to stand on, just to decree what's good or what's not good, we'd have no reason to follow any such moral teacher. A second characteristic is that a moral philosopher proceeds systematically. They present arguments. One step leads to another. And the third thing is that they present a system. So in other words, if you think about the great moral philosophers, they tend to have systems named after them. Kantianism, Kantian ethics, deontological ethics, Bentham, utilitarianism. We talk about Confucian ethics or Confucian role ethics is a term used to describe it by Roger Ames. Aristotle, virtue ethics. It adds up to a coherent whole. It adds up to a kind of a system. It's not just a series of little discrete teachings. Now, of course, if that indeed is what a moral philosopher looks like, then I think it seems to be the case that Jesus doesn't look like that at all. You don't get explicitly, at least, systematic arguments, premises and conclusions. There isn't a systematic proceeding either. Stories come, miracles happen, events occur. They happen in different ways, in different gospels, different orders. So there's not really a systematically thing there. And as for presenting a system, well, you might argue that in the divine version of Jesus Christ, there is a kind of a system there. There is a kind of a system, that humanity has sinned, it needs salvation, Jesus comes to do it, and those teachings are placed within the context of that system. So you do have a system if you adopt perhaps the full package as a Christian. But of course, this is a question I'm asking about whether Jesus is a great moral teacher if you don't believe he was a son of God, if he was just a human teaching. And in that sense, there doesn't really seem to be a system behind it at all. So it might look as though this whole project is doomed from the start. Jesus just isn't a moral philosopher, and that's the end of it. Now, interestingly, I'd like to point out that part of the process of writing the book was that I interviewed a number of Christian theologians and philosophers, and one or two people who weren't Christian as such, but had a deep interest in Christian ethics and Christian thought. Partly because I thought, I wanted to test these ideas out. I wanted to make sure I wasn't just getting it completely wrong. And there was pretty much a consensus that you don't find a complete moral system in the Gospels. Even people who are Christians themselves said that's not what he was doing. The Jesus of the Gospels emerges as a person from a particular tradition, the Jewish tradition. And a lot of the framework, a lot of the moral framework is taken for granted. It's assumed. He's not building from the ground up at all. So there are numerous occasions, for example, where people ask Jesus what they should do. And he says to them, well, you know the law. follow the law, honor your mother and father, keep the Sabbath, don't kill, all that kind of stuff. And then they have to follow up and push him to get any more concrete advice than that. And that is indicative of the way in which he, as I say, he emerged within a system. He didn't bring a system from scratch. And that's something that even Christians who believe in his divinity in some sense agree with. So, like I say, it might look like this project is therefore doomed. But I think it is actually more interesting than this. I think that what happens is that if you do look carefully at what Jesus taught, and you think about what philosophy does and what moral philosophy does, I think you can actually see that this actually sort of tells us interesting things about what the rest of moral philosophy is like. So it's not just a question of getting Jesus to tick the boxes of being a moral philosopher. If you interrogate these criteria for being a moral philosopher, I think under interrogation, they turn out to be a bit more interesting than you might think. So first of all, what about this idea that a moral philosopher proceeds systematically? Well, on that basis, you certainly would have to exclude someone like Confucius as a moral philosopher. In fact, pretty much all the Chinese classics, Mencius and other Confucians, and also the Taoist texts, you don't get a kind of systematic series of arguments there at all. You get these short passages, short stories, sometimes just a couple of sayings, a couple of sentences, sometimes a bit longer than that. It isn't remotely systematic in the way that it proceeds. Now, you might say that just goes to show why, when people say Confucius wasn't a moral philosopher, they're right. It's not a question of being Orientalist. It's not about being prejudiced. It's just that he fails to fulfill that basic criterion for being a moral philosopher. And therefore, it's right to think that he isn't one. But I don't think that can be right. If you do look at what you get in Confucius, if you're interested in moral philosophy, there is so much of interest in Confucius. You can't just dismiss it because it doesn't proceed systematically. And in a way that you might say, why must a moral philosophy proceed systematically? Now, it might depend partly upon what your goals are. I think that we're used to moral philosophy having the kind of goal of persuading people of the merits of a system on rational intellectual premises. So it's that making the argument is critical to it. But I think in a lot of traditions, the goal of moral philosophy is more practical. It's to help us to live better, to make better choices. And if you're going to do that, the most important thing isn't to develop a system, from point A to point Z and show all those tiny steps. It's to produce something which helps people in the process of self-examination, examination of their conduct, and improvement of their conduct. Now, of course, it's not philosophical unless there's some kind of reason giving there. That's true. But that doesn't mean it has to proceed in a systematic way. So I don't really think that this in itself should be any reason to think that Jesus can't be considered an important moral thinker. Other thinkers, of course, even in the Western tradition, whether they proceeded systematically or not in the first place, we don't know, because we only have fragments from them. So if you take anyone like the Stoic philosophers or people like Epicurus, we don't have fully fledged treatises from them. In fact, we don't even have that from Aristotle, to be honest. But nevertheless, people can see within those works ideas which have great merit and help us to think about ethics. And so the lack of systematicity in the presentation isn't seen as fatal. I don't think it should be seen as fatal for Jesus anyway. Nevertheless, you might say that still, at the end of the day, the Stoics, Confucius, the Taoists, whoever it might be, they do offer a system. They do give us a system at the end of the day. It can be reconstructed. We have a good idea of what Stoic philosophy tells us we should do and how we should live. And the Confucian system, it does add up to a coherent whole. It's based essentially on people fulfilling their social roles to bring about social harmony in ways that leads to the flourishing of everyone. Well, the point is that the moral philosophers who are perhaps most celebrated are perhaps like that, and for good reason. Of course, the greatest moral philosophers perhaps on the whole, have been those who do give us the full system. But we've got plenty of examples of very good moral philosophers who don't do that. And here's one, Bernard Williams, the late Bernard Williams, a wonderful philosopher, a great writer, a wonderful prose stylist, and also a very, very good thinker. I had the great privilege to interview him for the Philosophers Magazine. It turned out a few years before he died. And one of the things that came up in the interview was, that actually, he's not actually known for taking many positions on things. He counted two issues. One was to do with externalism and internalism. I can't even remember the other one, to be honest. On which he, had a position as such, and yet anyone, I think, who's read him, and most people would say that, of course, he is a great moral philosopher. And why is that? Well, it's because he brought great insight to things. He wrote essays, he wrote articles in which he identified very important problems and issues and characteristics. So, for example, talking about utilitarianism, he didn't have a kind of a fully fledged alternative to it, but he made a critique of utilitarianism on the basis that it failed to respect what he called the separateness of purpose of persons, the separateness of persons. So what's meant here is this: utilitarians say that the right thing is whatever produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And that means that in deciding what the right thing to do is, you treat everyone counts as one and nobody more than one, as Bentham puts it. That means you're treating everyone the same, which sounds wonderful. It sounds like that's a marvelous equality that we might want. But Williams is arguing that actually it's fundamental to our kind of moral being, and our moral existence, that we don't treat each other like that. That we recognize that there's a difference between A and B, and we're not just sort of carriers of well-being or carriers of happiness. So, for example, you would not be a more moral being if you didn't distinguish between your child and a stranger's child. You'd be a monster, of course, if you sort of just pursued the interests of your child to the detriment of any other child. But having a special preference for the well-being of your child is actually important to being a parent. And in the same way, other relationships respect that too. And what we value people for who they are, not just because they're individual bearers of consciousness and well-being. So I mean, that's just an example of someone who is fully recognized as being a very important moral philosopher and didn't offer a system at all. Now, I think what Jesus does, I think it's what makes it interesting, is that he didn't offer a system. That's true. What I concluded really at the end of the day was, what he does do is he provides important moral challenges. And these moral challenges, in a way, don't have to find their way into a great system for them to have their power. So, for example, take the idea of the various challenges he has about personal wealth, when he sort of tells the rich man who asks, how can I be good? The first thing he tells him, of course, is follow the law. And he says, yep, done all that. He says, right, now sell all you've got and give it to the poor and follow me. And the rich young man decides that's asking too much and walks away, very understandably, I think, particularly as there doesn't seem to be any reason given to do that to him. So what is the nature of that challenge and challenges like this? Well, you have to do a bit of piecing together to work this out. But again, I don't think that's a bad thing either. If the goal of a moral philosophy is to help us to make better choices and to live better, the fact that we have to do a bit of work ourselves and work things out for ourselves is no bad thing. Part of our moral development is to reflect upon the stories being told to us, the instruction given to us, and work out what really is the point. And there's a great line in Confucius, actually, where he says, this is a paraphrase, if I tell a student what one corner of the square is and they can't work out the other three for themselves, then I can't do any more. And it's this sort of metaphor from the fact that for someone to be instructable, they've got to be able to sort of fill in some of the gaps for themselves. And, again, in the Christian Jesus, the divine Jesus, you could say the call to give up your riches can be explained as part of a system, a vision of a good life in the long term, where the spirit lives on. I don't know what that might be. To be honest, I think it's quite difficult to work out what it would be, even within the fully divine version. But in the secular version, I think you can see how he's really saying to us, in a similar way to perhaps people like the Stoics, what is of ultimate value? What is the thing that really matters in your life? And doesn't wealth actually get in the way of that? Because what really matters is to, I think, to put it crudely, almost to become the best person you can be, the best version of yourself. And if you have riches, you're in a way you are burdened by them. I think that's the meaning of that famous phrase, as he said, as after the young man left, it's easier for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle. Um, Now, I think a very popular interpretation of that, which makes perfect sense to me, was the eye of the needle was a gate into Jerusalem. It's a very narrow gate. A camel could pass through the eye of the needle. So in that sense, it was easy. But the point is, the camel could only pass through if it didn't have anything on its back. It had to be unburdened. So that sort of fits the general idea very well. Wealth is actually a burden. It distracts us from what's important. And again, if we reflect upon our lives, I think we can understand that. We've all had, I think, well, okay, maybe we haven't. I think a lot of us, if we're honest, would say there are times in our lives where we get too wrapped up. We have certain things and we want to hold on to them, or we want to move to the next stage materially. And it actually does get in the way. You end up thinking about money more than you really know you should and know that you want to. And so therefore, there is something in that sort of challenge which is really worth listening to. And if it's a challenge worth listening to, then it's an important piece of moral teaching, even if it's not developing a complete system. Now let's move on to this idea about arguments next. So far you might say, okay, proceeding systematically isn't necessarily a requirement to be a philosopher, and having a whole system isn't. But you do need arguments, don't you? I mean, that's what distinguishes a moral philosopher from just a preacher or some kind of new age teacher, whatever it might be. The providing of arguments would seem to be absolutely critical for someone to count as a philosopher. I agree with that, actually, but I think that we have a very narrow idea of what an argument is. When you do a critical thinking course or you do a logic course, you're told that arguments are basically moving from premises to conclusions in that formalized way. When you look at most moral philosophy, it very rarely proceeds like that at all. And the point of this image is to remind me of one of the most famous arguments in contemporary moral philosophy. And that was one put forward by Peter Singer in his paper, Poverty, Famine and Affluence. Or maybe those words were in a different order. So you may know this argument already. It starts with a simple thought experiment. You're walking past a pond, and in this pond is a child out of their depth and drowning. You could wade in and pull the child out. The pond isn't so deep that you would, even if you can't swim, you could still do that. You will, of course, be ruining your lovely new suit, and you may be late for your meeting. What do you do? And of course, the answer is, unless you're a monster, of course, you wade in and you pull the child out. And what Singer suggests is that thought experiment, that example, demonstrates to us that there is a kind of implicit principle buried in there, which is that if you can significantly help the welfare of another person at a trivial or marginal cost to yourself, then you ought to do so. And then he generalizes from that and says that therefore, if that's a true principle, then it entails actually that there are lots of things that we can do to save. Like, people are dying all over the world as we speak. We could prevent those deaths by giving up things which are not essential to our well-being. A cup of coffee whilst we're walking around the shops would cost could cost up to about £3. We don't need that coffee. £3 could actually feed someone for a week. It could perhaps could even sometimes give some life-saving treatment. Some of these interventions are ridiculously cheap by various standards. So that's the way the argument works. Now, I'm not here to say whether or not that argument's a good one or not, but notice that it's not really it doesn't really conform to that image of a systematic argument of clear premises. The fundamental basis of the argument is actually an appeal to an intuition. The argument gets going, the premise is established by individuals saying, yes, in that situation, it would be monstrous not to take the child out. And you don't provide a reason at that stage. You don't provide a reason, you're just giving a moral response. The reason is generated afterwards. And it's not really a reason, it's a principle generated from that case. So lots of arguments in moral philosophy are exactly like that. So often they start with a thought experiment. And then from the thought experiment, some kind of general principle is established. And then you move on, and then you reach the conclusion and generalize from it. Now, actually, I think if you think about it in those ways, that is pretty much, apart from when Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount simply sort of says that certain people, the poor are blessed, etc., etc., that's how Jesus proceeds with his stories. And also not just the stories, but stories about Jesus. So, for example, let's take this very famous story of the woman caught in adultery. Actually, this probably isn't the picture of the woman caught in adultery, actually. Can't remember what this is a picture of. Perhaps someone could tell me. But often what happens is that Jesus tells a story, a parable. And what the parable does, like a thought experiment, is it elicits from us some kind of moral response. And then from that moral response, we are invited essentially to draw out the more general conclusion for ourselves. So I'll give the example of the woman caught in adultery. So a woman's found committing adultery. Interestingly enough, it seems like they don't drag the man before Jesus, of course. It's the woman they drag before him, and say, so do we stone her according to the law of Moses? And Jesus draws on the sand for a bit. He's very silent for a while, which is very interesting. And then he says, he who is without sin cast the first stone. And then people walk away. Now, this is a very, very compressed version. I mean, a lot of his parables are more elaborate, but the sort of general structure, I think, is pretty much similar. The story shows someone does wrong, and the question is, are you permitted to punish them by death? And he doesn't give an argument. He just says, well, if you are without sin, do it yourself. That invites us then to reflect on what the general principle is. And I think what we conclude is, what the characters in the story conclude, and what the reader is supposed to conclude too, I think, is that no one can say that of themselves. We're all sinners, we're all guilty. And therefore, we should refrain from that kind of harsh punishment. So it's actually, there is a kind of argument going on here. And I think there are arguments going on in other parables too. The Good Samaritan, for example, the story of the Good Samaritan tells a story, and at the end of it, you're asked to conclude, well, which of these people is the person's neighbor? You work it out for yourself. And then you draw a general conclusion from that. The story is a specific story about who stops to help someone in need. You look at that story and go, right, well, the neighbor was the person who helped. And you draw the conclusion more generally for yourself to be a good neighbor, and given, if you accept the fact you should love thy neighbor, to be a good neighbor requires you to act with that similar kind of concern and not to walk by on the other side. Again, notice, by the way, that I think in both these cases, the story of the woman taken in adultery and the Good Samaritan, these arguments have some kind of force, even sort of divorced from any wider system. They're not undercut, I think, or undermined because they're not part of some wider system. Whatever well, maybe not whatever, but people with very different kind of overall moral visions, if you like, can still feel the power of the challenges in these stories. So I actually think that in the case of arguments, it's not that Jesus actually does proceed carefully from premise to conclusion in a logically rigorous way. It's that moral philosophers don't do that either. So if you're going to be consistent, then I think you find that the way of proceeding is more similar in both cases. And there is a kind of argument. This is a complicated thing to go into in detail. My book, The Edge of Reason, I talk quite a lot about what makes a rational argument. But essentially, I think to make an argument is to offer reasons for a conclusion. And these have to be a certain kind of reason. They have to be reasons which are accessible and accessible and grounded in things that can be properly judged and so forth. And I think that's what Jesus does. He does point us towards reasons. But we see their reasons for acting in a certain way, not by making deductions, but by attending to what's going on and to recognizing what is the good course of action, what is the bad course of action. And that is exactly what happens in contemporary thought experiments, such as Peter Singer's. He's not giving us a rational argument for why the right thing to do is to pull the child out. He's asking us to attend carefully to what's going on and draw the conclusion for ourselves. Now, one final thing that I ought to say here is that actually, I talked about what those three criteria are for being a moral philosopher. But there's something that in the Western tradition, certainly contemporary Western tradition, that we don't talk about in terms of moral teaching, and that's the power of example. Aristotle did talk about this. A sort of training in virtue may result from associating with good people. So there's an idea here that moral instruction can actually be given not just by people saying words, but by the power of their own example. And I think that in lots of traditions, this is well understood and respected. So in Confucius, for example, in Confucian ethics, in the Confucian Analects, a lot of the teaching comes from showing the exemplary behavior of Confucius, or Confucius describing the exemplary behavior of others. There were models to follow. And in the same way that the arguments I talked to earlier work because we simply attend to what's going on and recognize what is good, I think the same thing happens with good people. You don't provide an argument for why the people Confucius is describing are good, or why Confucius himself is behaving in a good way. You kind of recognize it, you see it for yourself and move on from there. Now, in terms of providing an example, I think that's actually part of the way Jesus's moral philosophy is transmitted. And this is why it's not just about the teachings, it's about the life. The things that Jesus did. The Gospels are not just a list of teachings, they contain stories about what Jesus did. And these are meant to provide an example. Now, I have to say that I don't completely myself buy the fact that the example we're being presented with Jesus is the ideal model to follow in every respect. To my mind, and this might be self-serving, I do think that Jesus is kind of too ascetic, too otherworldly. I don't think he values enough the things of this world. His dismissal of family, for example, I think is too strong, too harsh, inhuman. So I don't agree with what his example teaches us, but I think, I don't always agree with it. But the fact that, attending to him as an example is part of the moral argument, if you like, I think it seems to me a perfectly reasonable way of proceeding as a moral teacher. So that's pretty much how I'd conclude. So what I conclude is, was Jesus a great moral teacher? I would not put him at the top of the tree for this at all. Interestingly enough, one of the theologians I talked to, Keith Ward, he said so too. He said, if you're going to assess Jesus simply as a moral teacher, he said Confucius and Aristotle, I think, would come up higher than Jesus. And that's not even how Christians see him primarily. But an interesting and valuable moral teacher, I think so. And I haven't really had time in this talk to talk about the various ways in which the challenges Jesus presents are still worth attending to today. But in broad terms, he challenges us about whether we're putting our values in the right place. We value too much worldly goods, worldly success, recognition. We don't appreciate enough how important it is to work upon ourselves, to really struggle to become better people. He has interesting things to say about forgiveness, actually, which is not that you just forgive and forget, but that forgiveness is about the healing of relationships, and that's a very important thing to do in life. So I think we do have someone who's worth paying attention to, in part because he's so out of step actually with society today. And in that sense, nothing's changed. What made him a radical figure at the time was he challenged the orthodoxy of the day. He's still valuable as a challenger to the orthodoxy today. So thanks very much. We'll stop there. We'll do questions. Can I just give a reminder, because I know this is tricky. The easiest way to ask a question is on most interfaces, there's a reactions button. And if you click on reactions, there's an option to raise your hand. And if you click that, we see the hand is raised. And if you can unraise it after we've asked you the question, that's very helpful too. Otherwise it stays raised forever. If you can't find that, in certain, I believe that in some versions of this, you find it under the participants list. You click the participants list and sometimes, or it used to appear there. And if you really can't, then the other thing to do is open the chat screen and type in your question, or just say, I would like to ask a question, but I can't find the hand. So let's take some, is everyone going to raise a virtual hand?
Yes, I'll encourage people to find the button now or type questions into the chat, which we can have a look at. And while you do that, I'll just ask one to get us started, Julian. And it's about the distinction between moralizing and doing moral philosophy. You know, there's no great confusion between philosophers of art on the one hand and painters and sculptors. You know, we can tell whether you're doing philosophy of art or you're painting something. But the boundary between, you know, moralizing, expressing a moral view, or encouraging people to share your moral view on the one hand, and doing moral philosophy on the other sounds quite blurry, or seems quite blurry. And that was picked up, I think, a bit in the earlier talks we had from Sophie Grace Chappell and Fiona Ellis, which were in a way sort of arguing for other kinds of moral philosophy, less systematic moral thinking, you know, the importance of epiphanies, or the importance of God in the world, as Fiona Ellis was describing it. Do you think there is a sharp distinction between moralizing, or between moral thinking and doing moral philosophy?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And by the way, congratulations for bringing in the other speakers in the series so seamlessly. Excellent sharing there. So, no, I can't see that there can be a strong distinction. I mean, I suppose this mean there isn't a distinction. I think that almost every distinction, there aren't many distinctions actually where they are completely sharp. You know, even 1 and 2, there's a distinction between that, but you know. Red and orange, there's no sharp distinction, but there is a difference. In this case, you know, there's one at the extreme of moralizing, as you put it, is simply exhorting people to do certain things without providing any reason or perhaps even any example of your own either. You know, just saying do it. That's so far down away from moral philosophy is completely separate. And there's also a kind of moral philosophy. Some forms of moral philosophy are actually concerned with rather arcane matters, perhaps of what's called meta-ethics and stuff, the nature and structure of ethics itself. And they're not really discussing anything about how you ought to live concretely. And they're very, very different from moralizing. But between those two things, there are all sorts of shades of grey, for sure, and all sorts of different things going on. And I don't think there would be a sharp distinction. And I think that I suspect I'd agree with Fiona and Sophie Grace that actually, you know, we're kind of limiting our resources if we think that the only kind of moral philosophy worth doing is that kind of systematic argumentation. But also, I also think, but like I said in the talk, it actually, I think, misdescribes what's actually going on in most moral philosophy. I think it's the sort of almost the dirty secret of moral philosophy is that the things that really power the arguments, the things that really get them going in the first place are appeals to intuition, right? So, you know, this is why there's been a huge interesting literature around the trolley problem, you know, where do you do you pull a lever and stop a runaway train killing 5 people and make it kill another one, and or do you do the same thing by pushing a fat person onto the tracks? These have been well discussed, and a lot of the discussion of that is based on the sort of horrific realization, really, that what you're trying to do in those arguments primarily is elicit an intuition from someone, and which intuition you elicit can be very different depending on exactly how you frame it. So, I think it's very important not to hold people who do moral philosophy in ways which look a bit different to a higher standard of argumentation than those people who do moral philosophy in the ways that we're used to, right? I think that's the challenge there.
Thank you, Julian. We have a lot of questions in the chat, and I think that the first and the last question are quite linked. John was asking if parts of the moral teaching of Jesus are really nothing more than motherhood and apple pie. Is it just the golden rule, do as you would be done by? And then there's a longer question at the end from Geeta Gurumurthy. Geeta, do you want to unmute yourself and ask that? Or if not, I'm happy to.
Yeah, okay. I'm Geeta's son. But you said at the beginning that Jesus' moral teachings, and this is the same thing, are kind of, platitudes, Instagram things. But I just thought that this is actually just the measure of how important they are for our moral universe. And I know it's something of a platitude or a caricature to say that pagan ethics is concerned with honor and loyalty and the demands of family and state, and less concerned with universal moral rules, less concerned with ascetic kind of abnegation of the self for other people. And Christian ethics replaces that. But I do think it's a caricature with some truth in it. And to the extent that that's an important part of our moral universe, I think Christianity is very important.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. So I suppose there are, so a couple of ways of approaching this. I mean, I think what you're suggesting there is that even if a lot of these teachings now seem platitudinous, they only seem platitudinous because they become so embedded in our culture we take them for granted. They were actually radical and important innovations, and for that reason we should recognize the importance of this. And I think that could be historically true. I'm not enough of a historian or historian ideas to know whether that's exactly true. I think that these lines of transmission are always rather complicated, and even in your question you suggested there was an element of caricature in it, but there's something to it. So something to it, I think that's right. Now that's true, but if that were true, it would mean in the sense Christianity was historically important, but maybe it's done its job and now there's not much more to learn from it. What we're left with are just everyday platitudes. But I don't think that is the case, because I think there are points of genuine interest in Jesus's teachings. And I mean, I mentioned a bit about forgiveness, for example. I mean, forgiveness is an interesting thing morally. What does it mean to forgive? Why should we forgive? Is there sort of arrogance to think you have the power to forgive? Who has that kind of right? And I actually think that if you look at what Jesus says about forgiveness, you actually get quite a rich and nuanced and insightful analysis of the role forgiveness should play. And it's, by the way, I think it's not unconditional. It's very clear it's not unconditional. You offer forgiveness, but if it's not taken up, then the person who you've offered forgiveness to, he says at the end of the day, you shall cast him off as a tax dealer or a heathen or something. You should just cast them aside. So I actually think that in addition to what you're saying, I still think there is some interest there. And that's why I go back to the first question, is it just motherhood and apple pie? I actually don't think it is. Sometimes it might seem like it because we take for granted what these things mean. But I think if you dig away and you sort of examine it more closely, it's always a bit more interesting than that. So, he who has 2 coats give to he who has none. I mean, it seems like a very sort of dull thing to say. And by the way, the golden rule isn't, I mean, Confucius has a version of it, and so does Kant, you might argue, and people don't accuse them of just being platitudinous. But anyway, but again, if you delve into what he's really saying about the role of wealth and why we should be giving it away, it is much more interesting than be nice and share things because everyone is equal. I mean, actually, I think one of the things that strikes me about his teachings about poverty is that actually I don't think Jesus, he doesn't want the poor not to be poor, right? He's not interested in eradicating poverty. And I know that might sound controversial, and a lot of Christians today, work very hard. They support charities like Christian Aid, who are one of the best advertising slogans ever, I think, which is "We believe in life before death," which was a nice way of overturning prejudices people might have about their mission as Christians. But actually, I think if you look at Jesus's teachings, sure, no one should be in dreadful, terrible suffering, but there's a sense for him in which poverty is a kind of blessing because you are liberated from those worldly concerns which divert you from the path of trying to become the very, very best person you can be. And in that sense, that's why the blessed are the poor. It's not blessed are the poor because they're going to be rich later. It's blessed are the poor, right? I mean, the poor wouldn't be blessed if poverty wasn't a good thing in itself. So I think that if you dig away at these things, it's hard to find anything which is actually really genuinely platitudinous. Really, I think it is deeper than that.
I'd like to come to Terry Rollinson's question. Terry, if you can unmute yourself, which is a question about context.
Yeah.
Terry, can you hear us? No, perhaps I'll ask it for...
Is he on the screen or has he disappeared? Can we see him?
You may have disappeared, but the question is...
I can see the question. It's worth asking. It's worth answering.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
The basis of the question was simply that if you regard Jesus as essentially an apocalyptic prophet, then really all he was interested in was people becoming, if you like, right with God before the day of judgment. And in a sense, some of his moral teaching has to be seen, I think, in that sort of context. So was he a moral philosopher? I don't know. But I think it's that context of apocalypticism that makes the case.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, Terry. I think this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, though, which was that what I'm really kind of doing with the book is I'm not trying to reconstruct what the historical Jesus said or didn't say. I think that would be foolish. I don't think we'd know about that. It is a kind of a thought experiment of, in a sense, Jesus exists for us as a character in the same way that perhaps Socrates does. Plato's Socrates. Who knows how accurate that is as a vision of the Socrates, but that's Socrates. So you can examine the teachings of Socrates as the character in Plato. Now, the point here is that the character of Jesus in the Gospels is a divine figure. He does miracles. You can question exactly what it means to say he was divine and the Son of God. These things aren't completely clear, but he was not an ordinary human. He performed miracles, so the question is it can only be about, if we assume that's all nonsense, is anything left? But the reason I think your question is still worth really thinking about is that I think that's kind of probably right. And I think most people do agree with this. As far as I can tell, most kind of biblical scholars and historians would say that, if you look at what's said in the Gospels and also in the epistles and et cetera, it did seem very, very clear that people were expecting literal end times to come quite soon. And that would mean, for example, that when I talk about his teachings about family and so forth, if you take that all away, you're changing the teachings, and arguably you're distorting them from what they originally were. Because one reason not to care about your family and so forth is because the end time's coming, right? So, the last thing you want to do is start a family. The same way as people today might think that, the planet's about to implode and therefore having children is irresponsible. If the end times are coming, you don't have a family. So I think that I'd be completely straight up about this. I think that almost certainly the most authentic interpretation of what the original intended meaning of the gospel writers was and the New Testament writers has to be seen in an apocalyptic framework. And therefore, as soon as you try and say, well, let's look at Jesus in a way that detracts from that idea of any kind of apocalyptic or divine thing, you're changing him from the Jesus of the Gospels, full stop. But that's fine, but you've got to be aware that's what you're doing. We're not uncovering the real we're not saving the real Jesus from his distortions of the gospel. We're trying to, as it were, see whether anything is worth salvaging from a Jesus when we simply don't believe the divine aspects of him. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. Chris has actually managed to find the raise hand button, so I think he should be rewarded by getting to ask his question live. Well done, Chris. Can you find the unmute button? You can. Go for it.
Yes, I think I've done that. Yes, I want to take issue with this idea that what Jesus said was just motherhood and apple pie or platitudes, because it strikes me one way was revolutionary for the time was this idea of equality, that the last shall be first, and that whoever does it to the least of my brethren does it to me, because the dominant ideology at that time before then was that the aristocrats are far superior to the common working people, and they've got divine right of kings and caste systems, and to say that the lowest just as good as anybody else was surely very challenging at the time, and probably even now.
Yeah, no. I'll just take that. I mean, I accept that. I think you're right about that. I mean, I'm not sure whether it's an equality as such. In a way, it's almost an inversion, because it's not saying the poor are as good as the rich. Saying the rich are really, they're the worst of the worst, and the poor are really quite virtuous. And I think that is quite different. I mean, I don't think, for example, in the kind of Stoic tradition and Epicureanism, for example, obviously they disregard worldly goods, at least in theory, not necessarily in practice, given that some of them are actually very rich, inconveniently. But still, there's not you sometimes do get the sense there that still the kind of life of contemplation and so forth that they're recommending is not the kind of life that someone's struggling to scrape an existence could have. It still seems to be a life of privilege in some way. So yeah, I agree. There's something very, very radical about that.
Thanks, Julian. We're coming to the end. We've got a couple more minutes. We do have more questions in the chat. Are there any that you would particularly like to answer?
No, you tell me. I haven't had a chance to scan them. So if you pick them.
Well, I think a couple that have come up are firstly, the extent to which Christian moral systems, such as the Catholic Church or Fletcher's situation ethics, resolve the lack of system in Jesus's own teachings. That's from Julia. And we also have a question from Edward. If you were to teach Jesus in a moral philosophy course, would you categorize him as a virtue ethicist or a duty-based ethicist or something else entirely?
Okay, yeah, good point. Well, I think it's true that the Christian tradition has found ways to fill in the gaps and to put Jesus into a system. Absolutely, it has. And in the Catholic Church, it's very, very explicit. In Catholicism, a key part of the doctrine is that the church itself is a continuation of that mission and a continued source of a kind of divine revelation. I'm not sure that's exactly the language they'd use, so please correct me someone if I'm wrong, but the unfolding of the mission that Jesus began is supposed to come from within the Roman Catholic Church. And therefore, over time, what we have in the original Bible is supplemented and fleshed out. And so, I think that's what a lot of the great Catholic theologians thought they were doing. And the Fletcher situation ethics, I'm sure it's the same kind of thing. So yeah, you could do that, and that's there's nothing illegitimate in that as a project. Lots of particularly ancient traditions are like that. In fact, actually, in a way, all the classical schools of Indian philosophy can be seen in that way. The classical schools of Indian philosophy, almost without exception, take as their foundational text the Vedas, which are given some kind of status as sort of like divine revelations of some sort. But the idea is that over time, the commentaries upon these, there's almost no such thing as an original philosophical text. What you have are commentaries on the Vedas, but these commentaries are in the business of fleshing things out, of providing greater systematicity, of providing a greater insight. And so the whole way in which that Indian tradition works is based on the idea that, you start with something incomplete and it becomes fuller over time. So that's true. I think that's reasonable. Of course, I wouldn't buy that because I don't have the Christian belief. I don't believe in the authority of the Catholic Church, but it's a coherent strategy. And remind me of the second one, because that was interesting too. Would we be a virtue ethicist? If we were teaching, would we be a virtue ethicist?
Or duty-based.
Or duty-based ethicist,
from Edward.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of, I'm slightly reluctant to kind of hold on to these categories too rigidly. I think that, once we start chopping up moral philosophers and putting them into neat camps, they're family resemblances more than anything else. But I do think that I don't think I would put him more towards the virtue ethics camp, because, well, first of all, he's very clear on many occasions that he is against an over rigid interpretation of rules and laws, right? I mean, time and again he says that, so he says he's up there to uphold the law, but he's upholding the spirit of the law and not the letter. So when his disciples are told off because they're essentially threshing wheat in their hand, they're rubbing wheat together in their hands, and that's considered work on the Sabbath, he dismisses the critics of that and saying, look, come on, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so he's against that sort of rigidity. And so I think that would make him a sort of unlikely deontological sort of duty-based philosopher. But in terms of the virtue ethics thing, I think it is the case that he's to me, the thing that I ended up concluding, it seemed to me almost incontrovertible, was that time and again his primary challenge is what they call metanoia. It's a transformation of the self, if you like. That seems to be his main goal. That's the thing that you're working on, right? And you're not trying to. This is partly the reason he seems to be disinterested in politics and relatively disinterested in even sort of, helping the poor is something that you sort of do along the way. But actually, a lot of the time, it's to help. It's to unburden yourself of your wealth. You're almost doing yourself more of a favour than you are the poor. So I think that strong emphasis on this metanoia, this self-transformation, makes him much more in the towards the virtue camp than the duty-based camp, I would think.
Thank you, Julian. I want to be respectful of your time, so we'll draw things to a close there. And there is an applause icon if you are so minded. Otherwise, you can unmute yourself and give Julian a big round of applause for his talk and answering so many of our questions.
Yeah.